The scream of a train horn shattered the silence. Willie froze. The ground beneath him trembled, the low vibration rattling up his spine. The metal rails groaned as a massive freight train thundered toward them, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin suns. And chained to those very tracks, right in the path of certain death, was an alien woman with violet eyes and deep purple skin. She didn't look afraid. She looked furious. "Get away!" she snarled, her voice rough but strong. Long black hair clung to her sweat-slicked skin, her sharp canines bared in defiance. "You can't save me!" Willie ignored her. He dropped to his knees, yanking his plasma cutter from his belt with shaking hands. His pulse pounded in his ears, nearly drowning out the roar of the approaching train. Shit, shit, shit. The shackles were thick, wrapped around her wrists and ankles, bolted straight into the steel tracks. Not just standard restraints. This was deliberate. Someone had wanted her dead, and they wanted it to be loud. The train blared its horn again, impossibly close now. A wall of metal and fury barreled toward them, dust and debris whipping around them in a violent storm. He flicked the plasma cutter on. The orange glow illuminated her face, her glare unwavering even as the wind from the train's momentum pulled at them both. "Hold still," he snapped. "I told you to leave." "Yeah. Well, I'm not the one about to get smeared across half this damn planet, so how about you shut up and let me work?" Sparks flew as the blade of plasma sliced into the first shackle. It was thicker than expected, reinforced with something beyond simple steel. The material resisted the heat, taking longer than it should to cut. Willie grit his teeth. Come on, come on, come on. The train was close enough now that he could make out the numbers on its front. The tracks rumbled violently beneath them. The first cuff snapped. He grabbed her arm, yanking her into a sitting position. "Move your legs!" She hissed as pain shot through her body, but she didn't argue. The second restraint around her ankle gleamed in the artificial light, the metal biting into her deep purple skin. He pressed the plasma cutter to it, watching as the blade burned hotter, the last layer of metal melting away. Almost there. A deafening horn, blinding light. The train was seconds away. Willie grabbed her wrist, hauling her forward as hard as he could. The chain around her other ankle snapped. With a final desperate lunge, he yanked her free, just as the train screamed past. The force of the wind knocked them both backward. They tumbled across the dirt and gravel, rolling until Willie slammed into a rusted-out track switch, pain jolting through his ribs. A moment later, the woman crashed against him, breathless and shaking. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The train roared on, oblivious to the lives it had nearly ended. Its lights disappeared into the night, leaving only the echo of its passing. Willie let his head fall back against the cold metal. "Holy shit!" he panted. The woman stirred against him. Her body was rigid, her breath uneven. Slowly she pushed herself up, her hands braced against his chest. Then, without warning, she grabbed his shirt and shoved him backward. "What the hell were you thinking?" she snapped, her violet eyes blazing. He coughed, trying to regain his breath. "Oh, I'm sorry. Was I supposed to let you die?" She glared down at him, her face close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her skin. "You should have," she said darkly. "You don't know what you've just done." He stared at her, chest still rising and falling rapidly. "Lady, I just saved your ass from becoming an abstract painting on the side of a train. A thank you would be nice." Her fingers curled into fists. He could feel the tremor in them, but whether it was from fear, pain, or rage, he couldn't tell. "You don't understand," she muttered, sitting back. "They were going to come back for me." Willie frowned. "Who?" She turned her head toward the horizon, her expression unreadable. And that's when he heard it. The distant hum of engines. Low, mechanical, approaching. He sat up, muscles tensing. A row of red lights flickered against the night sky, moving fast. "Friends of yours?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She didn't look at him. Her voice was quiet, almost resigned. "They're coming to kill us both." The hum of engines grew louder, a mechanical growl that vibrated through the ground. Willie's grip tightened around his blaster. His pulse hammered in his throat. Next to him, the alien woman, still breathing hard from her near-death experience, stared toward the horizon. Red lights flickered against the darkness, closing in fast. "Who are they?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Dominion hunters?" Her violet eyes darkened. "They want me dead. Now they'll kill you too." Willie exhaled sharply. "Well, that's just fantastic." She turned to him, gaze sharp. "Can you fight?" He scoffed. "Lady, I wouldn't have lived this long if I couldn't." The first hoverbike crested the ridge, its black frame reflecting the moonlight. A masked rider leaned forward, raising a long-barreled rifle. Willie grabbed the woman's wrist and yanked her behind a rusted-out train car, just as a shot rang out, sizzling past his ear. The metal behind them exploded in a shower of sparks. She jerked her arm free. "Don't touch me." "Yeah, the next time I'll let you take the bullet." Willie peeked around the wreckage, scanning their options. The train yards stretched for miles, littered with derailed cars and broken tracks. They had cover, but not much. The woman crouched beside him, rubbing her wrists where the chains had cut into them. "We need to move." "No kidding." Another shot, this one punched through the steel next to his head, spraying molten fragments. He cursed. "All right, new plan. Run first, argue later." She didn't protest. They bolted, weaving between rusted train cars as the hunters spread out. More bikes roared over the ridge, kicking up clouds of dust. Willie fired a few blind shots over his shoulder. A scream followed, but he didn't stop to check if it was a kill. The woman grabbed his arm, yanking him left. "This way!" A bullet struck the ground inches from his boot. "Anytime you want to explain why you've got an entire death squad after you, I'm all ears," Willie shouted, as they vaulted over a pile of twisted rails. Later, figures in sleek, dark armor dismounted their bikes, moving in formation. A voice crackled through a communicator. "Target is mobile. Cut them off." Willie cursed. He could hear the whine of energy weapons charging. If they got pinned, they were dead. They rounded a wrecked train car and skidded to a stop. A steep drop stretched before them. An old ravine, its floor jagged with scrap metal and debris. The woman glanced over her shoulder. The hunters were closing in. Willie's gut twisted. "You're not about to suggest..." She grabbed his shirt and shoved him. Air rushed past his ears as he plummeted. He crashed down, rolling through dirt and wreckage, limbs burning from the impact. A second later, she landed beside him, far more graceful, barely making a sound. Willie groaned, pushing himself up. "I hate you." She didn't dignify that with a response. Above them, the hunters reached the edge. One aimed down. Willie fired first. His blaster's energy bolt struck the hunter in the chest, sending him toppling back with a strangled cry. The woman seized his arm. "Move!" They scrambled over twisted wreckage, slipping between old cargo crates and shattered train parts. Willie gritted his teeth. "You got an exit strategy, or are we just hoping they get bored?" The woman glanced at a derelict tunnel ahead. There. The tunnel gaped like a mouth carved into the earth, its interior shrouded in darkness. It looked abandoned, forgotten. "Are you sure?" A grenade arced toward them. Willie tackled her, throwing them both behind a heap of metal as the explosion shook the ravine. Heat seared his back. He lifted his head, coughing through the dust. "That," he wheezed, "was too close." She was already up, eyes scanning. "They'll be on us in seconds." The hunters slid down the ravine walls, rifles raised. No more time. The woman grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward the tunnel. Willie didn't resist. They sprinted into the dark, leaving the Dominion hunters behind. The tunnel stretched before them like the gaping maw of some ancient beast, swallowing what little light remained from the surface. A faint, flickering glow from dying emergency strips barely illuminated the cracked walls, their once sleek metal now rusted and pitted with age. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic sound unnervingly loud in the suffocating silence. Willie leaned against the cold metal wall, pressing a palm to his ribs. His body screamed in protest. He had taken too many hits, run too far, pushed too hard. His pulse was erratic, his breath uneven. He had gotten out of worse scrapes before, but right now, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep moving. The woman Zira stood a few feet away, her violet eyes sharp even in the dimness. Despite the wounds marring her deep purple skin, she barely seemed winded. There was a tension in her stance, though, her muscles coiled, her shoulders rigid, like a predator not yet convinced the hunt was over. "We should keep moving," she said, voice low. Willie exhaled, tilting his head back against the metal. "Yeah, give me a second." Zira's gaze flicked to his side, where blood had soaked through his shirt. "You're injured." He forced a grin, though it came out more like a grimace. "Notice that, did you?" Instead of answering, she crouched beside him, her movements smooth and deliberate. He tensed, expecting some sharp remark or another warning about how he should have left her. Instead, she reached for the hem of his shirt. Willie's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Buy me dinner first." She glared at him, unimpressed. "Stop talking." With a quick yank, she lifted his shirt, exposing the wound. Willie hissed as the cold air hit raw, bruised flesh. A deep gash stretched across his ribs, the skin torn and swollen from the impact of the fall. He had taken worse before, sure, but that didn't mean this one didn't hurt like hell. Zara studied the wound with unreadable eyes. Then, without warning, she reached into the small satchel strapped to her waist and pulled out a slim vial filled with shimmering silver liquid. Willie eyed it warily. "That's not gonna turn me into a space lizard or something, is it?" She ignored the question. Instead, she flicked the cap off and dipped 2 fingers into the thick substance. Then, before he could react, she pressed them against his wound. Fire. A sharp, searing burn lanced through his nerves, so sudden and intense that his vision blurred. He sucked in a breath, every muscle in his body locking up. He said, "Stay still," Zara ordered. Willie clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to thrash as the sensation burned through him like molten metal. It felt like something was crawling under his skin, fusing the torn tissue back together, knitting muscle and sealing ruptured veins. Then, just as fast as it had started, the pain dulled. A cool numbness spread through him, his ragged breathing evening out. He exhaled sharply. That was unpleasant. Zira wiped the excess liquid off her fingers and recapped the vial. "It will speed healing." Willie gingerly pressed a hand to his side. The wound was still tender, but already the worst of the pain had faded. "You always carry magic space goo, or am I just lucky?" Zara's gaze flicked to his. "You're lucky." He smirked. "That's what I like to hear." She didn't respond. Instead, she shifted back, putting space between them. That was the moment Willie realized something strange. Despite how easily she had touched him to treat his wound, there was something hesitant about the way she moved now, as if she had only done it out of necessity, and now that the moment had passed, she wanted no part of physical contact. That told him more about her than anything else. Silence stretched between them. The distant drip of water echoed in the empty tunnel. Willie let his head rest against the wall, watching her out of the corner of his eye. "You want to tell me why your own people left you to die?" he asked eventually. She stiffened, just slightly. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, finally, she murmured, "I was betrayed." Her voice was flat, controlled, but Willie caught the edge of something buried beneath it. "Yeah, I figured that much," he said, shifting to get more comfortable. "Care to elaborate?" She hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, she spoke. "I was part of the Dominion," she said. "A soldier. I followed orders. I did what was expected of me. Something in the way she said it made Willie frown. Until you didn't. Her jaw tightened. Until I didn't? She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers as if testing their strength. They wanted me to be something I refused to become. Willie didn't push. He had seen enough in his life to recognize that kind of weight, the kind of burden that came with surviving something you weren't supposed to. Instead, he exhaled. Yeah, I know how that feels. She glanced at him, curiosity flickering behind her guarded expression. Do you? He gave her a small, humorless smile. More than I'd like. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then something shifted. Zara moved, not much, just enough that the space between them shrank, not enough to touch, not quite, but closer. Willie let the moment sit. He didn't rush it. Then, without thinking, he reached over and covered her hand with his. Her body tensed. For a second he thought she'd pull away, but she didn't. She stayed still, her fingers rigid beneath his. Then, slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice, her fingers curled slightly, just enough to acknowledge the touch. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. And for now that was enough. The fire burned low, embers crackling softly as they curled into the damp air of the abandoned tunnel. The flickering light carved shadows across the rusted walls, outlining the jagged edges of collapsed beams and forgotten machinery. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Willie leaned back against the cold metal, stretching his aching legs out in front of him. His body was battered, his ribs sore, but the healing serum had worked, at least enough to keep him from keeling over. The exhaustion in his limbs warned him he should sleep, but his mind was too wired, too aware of the woman sitting just across from him, her violet eyes reflecting the firelight. Zara. She hadn't spoken much since treating his wound. She sat near the fire, her long black hair cascading over her shoulder, methodically checking the edges of a blade she had pulled from her belt. The sharp edge gleamed under the dim light. Her posture was controlled, shoulders tense, as if she were bracing for something unseen. Willie sighed. You always this quiet? Zara didn't look up. You always this talkative? He smirked, rubbing his temple. Only when I'm avoiding the fact that my body feels like it got run over by a star freighter. A flicker of something, amusement maybe, crossed her face, but it was gone too fast to be sure. Willie exhaled. So, you want to tell me what your deal is? Zara's grip on the blade tightened slightly. He caught that. I mean, he continued more carefully now, I get the whole wanted dead by your own people thing. But what I don't get is why you were on those tracks in the first place. She didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending tiny sparks into the stale air. Then, quietly, she said, It was a message. Willie frowned. For who? Finally, she looked up. For me. His brows furrowed. That's a hell of a way to send a message. Zara set the blade down, her fingers flexed before curling into fists. They wanted me to understand that I was no longer one of them, not worth a trial, not worth execution, just discarded. Willie studied her. He had seen that look before, the kind of emptiness that came after betrayal so deep it left a scar. After a moment, he shook his head. Idiots. Zara blinked. What? They should have killed you, he said simply, because leaving you alive, that was their biggest mistake. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe. Then, unexpectedly, she smirked. Not the sharp, bitter kind she had given him before. This was softer, more thoughtful, almost like she was seeing him differently for the first time. Willie grinned. There it is. I was starting to think you didn't know how to smile. Zara rolled her eyes. I should have left you back in that ravine. Yeah, but then who would you have to argue with? She exhaled, shaking her head. but there was no real irritation in it. Silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. After a moment, Willie shifted, wincing slightly as he reached for the edge of his shirt. He could still feel the dull ache from where the Dominion hunter had gotten a lucky shot earlier. Zira noticed. Before he could protest, she was already moving, closing the small space between them. "Let me see," she murmured. "I'm fine." She gave him a pointed look. Willie sighed. "You're real pushy, you know that?" Zara didn't respond. Instead, she reached forward and pushed his shirt up, her fingers brushing against his bare skin. Willie froze. Her touch was warm, firm but not rough. He could feel the heat of her palm as she examined the bruising, her fingertips ghosting over his ribs with surprising care. His breath hitched, just slightly. Zira noticed. She glanced up at him, her violet eyes locked onto his. Neither of them moved. The air between them shifted, charged with something neither of them acknowledged, but both of them felt. Her fingers didn't move away. Willie swallowed. "This the part where you break another one of my bones?" Zara's lips twitched, just barely. Then, instead of pulling away, she did something he did not expect. She traced a slow, deliberate path down his side. Willie's heart slammed against his ribs. It wasn't a calculated touch, it wasn't a test, it was instinctive, and that was what made it dangerous. Zara seemed to realize it at the same moment he did. Her fingers stilled, but she didn't pull away. Willie exhaled, forcing himself to speak. "So, you want to tell me what that was?" Zara said nothing. Then, so quietly he barely heard it, she murmured, "You shouldn't want this." Willie's jaw tensed. Too late. Zara's breathing was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her lips parted slightly, like she was caught between running and staying. She chose staying. And then, just like that, she kissed him. It wasn't careful, it wasn't slow. It was desperate. Zara's hands curled into his shirt, pulling him forward as her lips crashed against his. She tasted like fire and something raw, something untamed. Willie groaned against her mouth, his hands finding her waist, his grip firm but reverent. He felt the press of her body against his, the way she moved as if this was something she had denied herself for too long. She kissed him deeper, her fingers sliding into his hair, gripping tight like she needed to hold on to something real. Willie responded in kind, his hands traveling up her back, feeling the tension coiled beneath her skin. He let himself sink into it, let himself forget for a moment that the universe outside of this moment even existed. Then Zira pulled away. Breathing ragged, lips slightly swollen, she looked at him with something close to fear. Not fear of him, fear of herself. Willie stared at her, his chest rising and falling. "I can't," she said abruptly. Then, before he could stop her, she stood. She turned away, retreating into the darkness of the tunnel, her body stiff, her hands clenched into fists. Willie exhaled, running a hand down his face. Shit. He had just gotten a taste of something electric, something real, something that could burn him alive. And from the way Zira had fled, he wasn't the only one. The tunnel trembled. A deep, mechanical hum rippled through the ground, growing louder. A predator's growl before the strike. Willie tightened his grip on his blaster. His body was still aching, but adrenaline burned through his veins, forcing him into sharp focus. He didn't need Zira to tell him. The Dominion had found them. Across from him, Zira stood rigid, her shoulders squared, her violet eyes locked on the distant glow of approaching lights. Whatever had passed between them moments ago, whatever had ignited in that kiss, was shoved aside, buried beneath the weight of survival. No more room for hesitation. The first explosion rocked the tunnel, a controlled blast, not meant to kill, but to cut off their escape. Willie staggered but caught himself against the wall as dust and debris rained down. A silhouette emerged from the thick smoke. Not just another faceless Dominion soldier. Tall, broad, encased in gleaming black armor with silver inlays. The way he carried himself, calm, effortless, told Willie everything he needed to know. This wasn't just some grunt. This was someone who believed himself untouchable. As the smoke thinned, the man's features sharpened in the dim emergency lights. Golden eyes, strong jaw, a thin scar tracing down his temple. He looked just like Zira. Willie's pulse quickened. He didn't have to ask. The resemblance was too sharp, the tension in Zira's posture too rigid. Still, he needed to hear it. He glanced at her. "Friend of yours?" Zira didn't blink. Her voice, when it came, was like steel. "My brother." Willie muttered a curse. "Well, that complicates things." Rack stepped forward, slow and deliberate, exuding the kind of control that came from knowing he was the most dangerous man in the room. His eyes flicked to Willie first, casual, uninterested, then back to Zira. "Hello, traitor." Zira didn't react, but Willie felt the air shift, as if the temperature had dropped. Reich clasped his hands behind his back, tilting his head slightly. "I thought you would have died with more dignity." He glanced at Willie again, lips curling in distaste. "Instead, you're hiding behind a human." Willie let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Man, you Dominion types really love hearing yourselves talk, huh?" Reich ignored him. "I'll give you one chance, Zira," he continued, his voice smooth, almost gentle. "Come with me now, and I will make it painless." Zira didn't answer immediately. Willie's gut twisted. He had never seen her hesitate before, not like this. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating. She knew Reich too well, knew how he fought, knew exactly what he was capable of. And she wasn't sure she could win. Willie couldn't let that doubt fester. "Here, I'm going to have to veto that plan," he said, stepping slightly in front of Zira, raising his blaster. "Not in the mood to let a jackass in fancy armor execute my partner?" Reich exhaled through his nose. "This doesn't concern you, human." "Yeah," Willie smirked. "See, I feel like it does, since you're pointing a kill order at the only person keeping me from getting my ass vaporized." Reich gave him an unreadable look before his hand drifted to his belt. He pulled out a sleek circular device. A small, sharp beep filled the air. Ping! A wave of agony slammed into Willie's nervous system, searing through every nerve like fire. His legs gave out, his blaster fell from his grip as his muscles spasmed, body convulsing under an invisible current. He barely registered Zira shouting his name. The pain stopped. Willie gasped, vision swimming as he collapsed to his hands and knees. His limbs still twitched, his heart hammering in erratic beats. Rake crouched beside him, tapping the device against his knee. "You humans are so fragile." Willie, still shaking, managed to lift his head with effort. Through gritted teeth, he muttered, "Yeah? Well, your breath sucks." Wright chuckled. "I'll enjoy watching you die." A blur of motion. Zira lunged. Her blade struck like lightning, aimed directly for Reich's throat. Reich caught her wrist mid-strike, twisting it violently. The sound of bone grinding against bone made Willie wince, but Zira didn't flinch. She spun, using the momentum to drive a kick toward his ribs. Reich deflected it effortlessly, stepping back as if he had expected it. Zira attacked again, faster this time, every move calculated, every strike relentless. But Reich was just as fast. He sidestepped, countered, and dodged, his motions fluid, tauntingly controlled. "Still predictable," Reich said, smirking as he blocked another blow. "No wonder they abandon you." Zira's movements faltered for half a second. That was all Reich needed. He drove a fist into her stomach, hard. Zira gasped, staggering back, but before she could recover, he grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the tunnel wall. Willie's heart stopped. Rake leaned in close, his voice quiet. You hesitated. Zarek clawed at his grip, but he was stronger, pinning her effortlessly. Willie's vision snapped into focus. No hesitation, no second guessing. He grabbed the nearest thing. His fallen blaster was too far, so he snatched up a rusted pipe from the ground. And swung. The impact landed against Reich's skull with a sickening crack. Reich grunted in pain, releasing Zara as he staggered back. She didn't waste a second. Zara exploded forward, slashing deep across his arm. Blood sprayed. Reich stumbled, gripping the wound. His golden eyes flickered with something new. Surprise. Willie grabbed Zero's wrist. We need to go. Now. More Dominion soldiers flooded into the tunnel, weapons raised. Reich, still gripping his bleeding arm, chuckled darkly. You can't run forever. Zara's breath was uneven, her fingers still clenched around her blade. She didn't move, didn't turn to run. For a terrifying second, Willie thought she was going to stay and fight, that she was going to let herself die here. He yanked her arm, hard. Zara, he snapped, his voice raw. Move. Her gaze locked onto his. Then, finally, she turned and ran with him. Blaster fire streaked past them. The tunnel shook as they sprinted, dodging falling debris, the Dominion's shouts echoing behind them. Willie didn't look back, didn't slow down, but his mind kept replaying one moment. Zara had hesitated, not because she was afraid, because for a single breath she had been willing to let him go. And that terrified him more than anything. They ran until the world blurred. Blaster fire rained down, streaks of blue and red searing the air around them. Each shot sizzled against rusted metal, illuminating the ruined tunnel in violent flashes. The Dominion soldiers were relentless, closing the distance with military precision. Willie's lungs burned, his ribs ached from where Reich's device had nearly fried his nervous system. His legs threatened to buckle, but he forced himself forward, dragging Zara with him. She had hesitated back there. He still couldn't shake the image from his mind. Her, standing in the fight longer than she should have, as if she wanted to stay, as if she had been willing to let him go. Not happening. Up ahead, the tunnel widened into a cavernous chamber, once an underground transport hub. Old freight haulers sat abandoned, their hulking frames covered in decades of dust and decay. Rusted catwalks stretched above, leading to vents barely big enough to squeeze through. A dead end. Tell me you have a plan, Willie panted, pulling Zara behind the cover of a corroded shipping container. Zara wiped blood from her lip, her breath steady despite the chase. We make our stand. Willie groaned. Yeah, I was afraid you'd say that. A blaster bolt struck the crate, sending molten shrapnel flying. Willie ducked, cursing under his breath. Any chance we can rethink that whole fight to the death angle? Zara scanned the chamber, her sharp eyes locked onto a cargo elevator on the far side. Its platform barely hanging on, ancient wires frayed from age. Above it, a vent shaft led to open ground. She pointed. There. Willie followed her gaze. You do see the drop under that thing, right? We slip. We're paced. Zara looked at him. Then don't slip. He let out a short laugh. Oh, great advice, thanks. More blaster fire cut him off. The Dominion had reached the entrance, their armored forms spilling into the space like a black tide. At the front stood Reich, golden eyes gleaming through the smoke. Enough! Reich called out, his voice sharp, commanding. His soldiers didn't fire. They waited. There is nowhere left to run, Zara. Zara stepped out from cover, blade still clutched in her grip. Then I won't. Willie swore under his breath but followed her, blaster raised. Reich studied them. The cut on his arm from their last fight still bled, staining his sleek armor, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes flicked to Willie. Tell me, human, how does it feel to die for someone who will never be yours? The words hit harder than they should have. Willie kept his gun steady, forcing a grin. Pretty sure you've got that backwards, pal. I'm not the one bleeding. Rake smirked. Not yet. Then he moved. Fast. Too fast. Zira met him head-on, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. She struck high, aiming for his neck, but he blocked effortlessly, twisting her wrist and sending her staggering back. Willie fired, but Rake anticipated it, using Zira as a shield. Willie hesitated a fraction of a second, just enough time for Rake to close the gap. A brutal punch slammed into Willie's ribs. He gasped, doubling over. Zira lunged again, blade flashing, forcing Rake to disengage. She pressed the attack, each strike faster, more precise. But Rake was stronger. He caught her next blow mid-swing and drove a knee into her stomach, sending her to the ground. Willie fired again. This time he didn't hesitate. The shot clipped Rake's shoulder. Not enough to kill, but enough to piss him off. Rake turned toward Willie, eyes burning. Zira, still on the ground, looked at Willie, something frantic in her expression. "Run!" He didn't. Instead, he charged. Rake was faster. He caught Willie by the throat, lifted him off the ground, and slammed him against the rusted hull of an old hauler. Pain exploded through Willie's back. He gasped, struggling, but Rake's grip was unbreakable. "You're nothing," Rake murmured, tightening his hold. "You should have stayed out of this." Willie's vision blurred. Black spots danced in his eyes. But then Zira screamed. Not a sound of pain, a sound of rage. Rake barely had time to turn before she was on him. She didn't use her blade. She tackled him, driving him back with sheer force, her hands clawing at his armor, her strength unnatural. Her eyes glowed. Willie hit the ground, sucking in air as he watched, stunned. Rake struggled. Actually struggled. For the first time he looked shocked. "You don't get to take him," Zira snarled. Then, with a roar, she drove her elbow into Rake's chest, denting his armor. Rake gasped. Zira struck again. And again. Willie had never seen her like this. She was fury. She was vengeance. Rake stumbled back, coughing, disoriented. His soldiers hesitated. They had never seen him lose before. Zira grabbed Willie's wrist and pulled him up. No hesitation this time. They ran. Rake recovered fast. "Stop them!" Blaster fire filled the air. Zira and Willie dived onto the cargo elevator. Zira smashed the controls with the hilt of her blade, overloading the circuits. The platform jerked upward with a violent shudder. He ascended fast, but not fast enough. Rake lunged, jumping onto the elevator with them. Willie swung his blaster like a club, catching Rake across the jaw. The Dominion commander reeled, but barely. Zira shoved Willie behind her. Then she did something unexpected. She threw her weapon away. Rake frowned. "What are you—" Zira tackled him. She forced him to the edge of the elevator, feet skidding against metal. Rake realized too late. Zira let go. And Rake fell. Willie barely had time to process before the elevator slammed into its final stop. The impact sent them both sprawling into a ruined rooftop under an open sky. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, breathing heavily, Willie turned to Zira. "Ha ha ha ha! That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen." Zira, flat on her back, let out a breathless laugh. She turned her head toward him. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. Then, before Willie could think, she grabbed his collar and kissed him. This time it wasn't desperate. It was slow, deliberate. Willie melted into it, fingers sliding into her hair, holding her like he might lose her again. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I thought I lost you," she murmured. Willie smirked. "You almost did." She exhaled, eyes closing. "No more running." He nodded. "No more running." They lay there, catching their breath under the stars. Together, the end.